Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm excited to share with you the new insights into boosting day-to-day memory. We're going to talk about how to improve memory, how to boost memory, and we're going to also focus on aspects of memory in this time and how these times are impacting our memory. I start with my big take-home message, which is that at any age, there are things you can do to improve your memory, and that's really an important insight, that there's these actionable things that we can. Let's start with this question: is there such thing as a photographic memory? Is this something that we should be looking up to or yearning to have? Is this something that we should say, oh, that person has a photographic memory, I wish I had a photographic memory? So you hear about this all the time, but does it really exist? So I want to share with you this quick story. There was a student at Harvard, her name was Elizabeth, and she was working with a professor there, and the professor wrote a paper on her and published it in a journal called Nature. And he said that this student of his, Elizabeth, had a photographic memory. She had this incredible memory. She could look at something and remember everything that was on the page. Turns out the professor at Harvard ended up marrying Elizabeth. And after they got married, he never released another study on her at all. Nothing was ever released, and he refused to show any of the data. So something about that seems a little fishy. So essentially, we really believe now that there's really no such thing as a true photographic memory. It's never been identified. This was the only time where we thought maybe there was, and then we pretty much have thrown this away, that this was something else was going on there. So photographic memory is not something that actually exists. But there are people who have incredible memory, amazing memories, and we can learn from them. And that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to learn how do they do it and how do we adopt this in our day-to-day life. And people who have amazing memories, they generally fall into three categories, three different types of categories. And one is savants. And so this is Kim Peek. And if you saw the movie Rain Man, if you remember that movie, he was who Rain Man was patterned after. This is the real life Rain Man. This is Kim Peek. And just to show you what he could do with his incredible memory is he could memorize every book he ever read, every page, and he could read. He read over 9,000 books, and it would take him 12 seconds to read a page. That was all tested. And on top of it, he could read the left page with his left eye and the right page with his right eye simultaneously, and all the information went in. So with this incredible memory, Kim Peek, though, also couldn't do certain things. He actually couldn't remember how to button up his shirt. He couldn't remember how to tie his shoes. He really couldn't function throughout the day in terms of general daily memory tasks. And that really is the definition of a savant. It's somebody who has this incredible, unbelievable memory, but at the same time, they cannot do what we would think of as basic memory tasks. So that's a savant. That's one type of individual with incredible memory. The second type of individual is a condition called hyperthymesia. And you might have seen interviews with Mary Lou Henner. She's probably the most famous patient that has this condition. And she has what you would call superior autobiographical memory. And what that means is it's almost like she has a mental calendar. There's another individual who's been studied named Jill Price who has this. And essentially what happens is that she can remember any day of her life in great detail. So if you said to individuals with this condition, what happened on September 2nd, 1985? They say, well, I had Cheerios for breakfast and one egg, and then I watched this on TV, and my friend called, and we talked about this, and they remember every detail of everything that's ever happened in their life. It turns out, though, that first of all, there's very few people in the world that have this. It could be somewhere around 20, and it's very hard to identify these people. But there's very few people that actually have this, and it really doesn't carry over. So in terms of people say, oh, this would be amazing, I could do incredible on tests, or I could do incredible in my job, but it doesn't seem to carry over to other aspects of memory. It's just autobiographical memory, not learning something for a test or learning something for your work. So we'll talk at the end about some insights into this type of memory. And then the third type of individual that we're going to learn from that has incredible memory is individuals who are mnemonists. And so this is one individual. He's really one of the first people that was identified, Solomon Schervesky. And so his quick story was that he was at work one day and he was in a meeting and his boss was rattling on and on and on and talking about something. And I guess Solomon looked like he wasn't paying attention. And the boss said, Solomon, are you taking notes? And he said, no, I got it all up here. And he said, well, would you like to repeat what I just said? And Solomon proceeded to repeat word for word everything he had said for the last 20 minutes in exact detail. And at that point, Solomon was actually surprised that other people didn't have this ability. And it turns out that there are people who have this ability to remember things in great detail. It's not a photographic memory. They actually use tricks, and we're going to talk about what those are. And so that's the third type of people who have incredible memory, and we'll learn from them as well. And we'll learn from them right now. You're going to do really quickly a pop quiz. Don't get worried. It's not graded. It's just for fun. But the pop quiz that we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a quick memory test, and then I'm going to show you how these memory champions or how they can really optimize their memory. And this is a trick you can use in your day-to-day life. So this is involved with memorizing lists. So if you take a look at these 6 random things, this is a list. If I asked you to memorize this: magnet, chocolate, blanket, chapstick, apple, and pants, and I just gave you a moment or two, most people would have a very hard time with this. That's actually quite normal. It's nothing to be worried about. But I'll give you a moment to try to memorize it. You can see if you got it back. I'll give you just a moment. And you can try now and see if you got it back. Some of you might be able to, and some of you can't. And again, if you can't, do not worry. But I want to show you a trick to optimize this type of memory. And it's something called memory of loci. And so this is a really old technique. It goes back way, 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 way back with our ancestors who wanted to remember large amounts of information or lists when they didn't have paper and pen, they didn't have computers or anything like that at all. And it's based upon the idea or the insight that your memory is really powerful when it comes to memorizing locations. If you think about your ancestors a long, long time ago, if they could remember how to get from point A to point B, or when they would go out and look for food and they could remember how to get home, those ancestors that remembered how to get home, they're your ancestors. But if you had any ancestors that got lost and they couldn't remember how to get home, they couldn't remember locations, very likely they got eaten and they didn't pass on their genes. So it's deeply embedded in our brain to remember locations. And so the way that this trick is used is based upon that ability of our brain to really remember locations very well, is that what memory champions often do is when they have to memorize a long list, they will take each thing on the list and place it in a specific part of their home or their childhood home. And so they will say, okay, the first thing on the list is at the front door, and the second thing on the list is in the kitchen, and the third thing on the list is in the, in the den, and they put each item in those locations, and they imagine that happening, and then they retrace their steps and remember the list. Now, since we all have different layouts to our home, I want to show you a really quick an easy way to use this trick and technique by using your face. So let's go back to this list and let's use the locations of your face to remember this list. So magnet, I want you to imagine a magnet attached to your forehead. Then I want you to imagine chocolate coming out of your ears. I want you to imagine a blanket covering your eyes. I want you to imagine chapstick up your nose. I want you to imagine an apple in your mouth. And then I want you to imagine pants that you're holding onto with your neck. So I want you to take a moment and see if you remember that. Okay, let's see how it goes. What was attached to your forehead? Do you remember magnet? What was coming out of your ears? Chocolate. What was covering your eyes? A blanket. What was up your nose? Chapstick. What was in your mouth? It's an apple. And what was attached to your neck? Pants. Okay, if you didn't get it, don't feel bad. This can take a little practice. Practice it over the next couple days. But if you did get it, you might be surprised how quickly you did remember those things based on tapping into this memory of loci. So let's go on and talk a little bit more about your brain, because the insights into memorizing things, remembering things, and optimizing memory comes from a little bit of insight into how your brain works. So how much can you remember? How much can your brain remember? Your brain can remember about 2.5 petabytes of data. So what is that? We're not used to hearing about petabytes of data. That's about 300 million hours of television. What's 300 million hours of television? That's if you watched television pretty much every day of the year, 24 hours a day for 34,000 years. That's a lot of TV. So you might be saying, wait a second, my brain can hold that much information. That's the capacity of my memory, yet I can't remember where I parked my car, and I can't remember where I put my keys, and I can't remember, what I just wrote something down or what I just was doing. And these types of memory, these little issues with our memory are actually, I want to tell you, are quite normal. But there's things we can do to optimize them. We're not talking about really dementia today. We're talking about day-to-day memory and how to optimize it. And so in order to minimize these day-to-day memory issues, where did I put my keys? Where did I park my car? Where's that important piece of paper? A key insight is what we're looking at here. So if you look at this picture of Steve Jobs, you'll notice that from 1999 to 2010, he pretty much wore the same thing every day. And he could definitely afford to have a different outfit. But he was aware of an insight into how the brain works. And what that is that focus, our ability to focus and remember things, focus is a key part of remembering, is a limited resource in the brain. Think of it like your battery to your cell phone. As the day goes on, it wears down. And it's very similar to if you're in the gym and you see somebody and at the beginning they're doing some really good sets, and then as time goes on, you know, the sets aren't looking so pretty anymore, and the technique and the form. And so essentially what the idea is that Steve Jobs realized this, and he figured, you know what, since focus is a limited resource, I'm not going to waste any of my mental battery on picking out an outfit. I'm going to save that for things that I really need to focus on. And in no way am I saying we should all start wearing the same things each day. But the idea is to just be aware of, A, when you're trying to remember something, also when you're trying to make a decision, and also be aware of when you're trying to focus on things and how charged up your battery is. Remember that the battery drains throughout the day. And so establishing routines for things that you are forgetting often can be really helpful. And so what we really want to do is we want to get it off of our list of things we have to remember. So for example, if we are constantly losing our keys, then we have a place for our keys and we always have them there. And then that takes away the idea that we have to even spend or waste any focus on this memory task, and it's just always in the same place. Or that piece of paper that, you know, you're always looking for, where did I put it? We always have a certain place for things, because what that does is it doesn't waste mental energy, and it allows us to free up our memory for other things that are more important to be remembering. Now, if we forget, there's something to be aware of, and that is that we might have never really learned it. And that's not in all cases, but very often is that we think that we remember something, we think that we learned it, and we wonder why we didn't remember it, and it's because we didn't really go through all the steps of memory. So the first step is focus, which we just talked about. We really have to zero in and focus on it, not be distracted. The second thing is we have to form a short-term memory, and the last thing is we have to form a long-term memory. And if we don't go through all these three steps, it's very hard to remember things. We can just say, oh, I think I went through the three steps, but I didn't really go through it, and those things are often not remembered. So let's give one more tip on how to boost focus, because it's easy to say, but how do we actually zero in and focus on things that we want to do, or how do we increase this ability in the brain? So our ability to focus is based upon our brain releasing a chemical called dopamine. And dopamine is a chemical that's released in between your brain cells. And when you release dopamine, you cause your brain cells to become active in terms of focus. And again, we go back to our ancestors, because our brain evolved over quite a bit long time, and so the brain we have today is really based upon what happened a long time ago. And so if your ancestors were in the wilderness, they're walking around the forest, and things were just like they always are day to day, no surprises, then they really didn't focus or pay attention. But if anything new happened or surprising, that triggers the brain to release this chemical called dopamine. And what happens is when we release dopamine, we focus. So anything new or anything surprising really forces our brain to pay attention, because our survival depends upon it. Our ancestors that didn't pay attention to new things could get injured or hurt or miss out on an opportunity to learn something important. And so to think about this is that each day we really want to give our brain some dose of newness. And what's interesting is it doesn't have to be that much. It doesn't have to be a major change. We don't have to go on a trip to a new location, although those things can be beneficial to the brain. But especially in these times where we're in different parts of the world, in different parts of the country, things are more the same each day because of the shelter at home that we've been going through, or the social or physical distancing. But the idea is that not missing out on incorporating every day something new. So this could be when you go for your walk, pick a new street, cook a new recipe, put something together that it means using the instructions that you've never put together, learn a new song. It really doesn't matter what it is, but find some newness. There's these really interesting studies that find that people focus better if they're having trouble focusing, that they just pick a new room in their house to do some work or focus in, or pick a new location in the office. That newness triggers dopamine, helps the brain focus. So just making sure in these times we're getting a dose of newness. Again, it doesn't have to be a big dose, but just something that we're not doing the same each day. Okay, so on our 5 factors for a healthy memory, these are the things that were shown to be really helpful in boosting natural memory. We've already accomplished one. We're 1 out of 5 down. And number 1 on that list, what they found really helped people was continuing to learn new things. People who continue to engage in new activities and learning new things had much more optimal memory as the years went on. So this could be a new language, a new subject, a musical instrument, a new sport. It doesn't have to be a brain gain. So those things that we see that advertised, those aren't really the answer. They don't seem to really help that much. But it's something that you want to learn, something you want to enjoy. It could be your brain science. But keep learning new things. That challenge to the brain releases dopamine, helps focus, helps our memory. Okay, so another quick tip is that you might have noticed over the last few months that the days seem to blur together. And that's very common and very understandable. If you think about the last few months, again, because we're having so much of the same day to day, oftentimes we're not leaving to go to work. If we are, we're not doing a lot of the outside of work or home or activities that we're used to doing. And that causes the brain to have a very difficult time keeping track of time. The way the brain likes to keep track of time and remember events is it has what we call pillars of events. If you think about your past, you say, oh yeah, I went to that wedding, or I went to that graduation, or I went on that vacation. It's a really specific thing that we actually have a pillar and we say, oh, it was before or after that event. But a lot of those events haven't been happening in the last few months. So the key thing is that if you're having any issues where you're like saying, you know, what day is it? Or what happened over the time is just blurring by. It can be important to bring back into our lives these ideas of a pillar event. So it doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be a graduation or a wedding, but it can just be that, oh, on Wednesday, we had a French night in our house. We tried to cook French food, or we tried to learn a little bit about the country of France, or just whatever it is that we just have a day and a specific new thing on that day. Even attending this talk, you know, this was on Wednesday, and then what I did, always trying to think about putting these things into our day that are new or different, and having what happened before and after as a pillar to that event. So just finding things like that can be really helpful to avoid that blur of the last few months, which is very common and understandable. Okay, let's go deeper now into how to maximize our memory. We talked about focus. Now let's talk about short-term and long-term memory. So in order to optimize, we'll just do a little bit of insights into how the brain works. When you make a memory, you learn anything new, you cause your brain cells to reach out and make a new connection. So you have about 80 billion brain cells in your brain, and this is a representation of 2 of them. So here's one and here's the other. And anytime you learn something, a subset of those 80 billion brain cells reaches out and makes a new connection. And so if you didn't know anything that we've talked about in the last almost 20 minutes, then you're doing one of the best things you can do for your brain. You're causing your brain cells to reach out and make a new connection, and that is essentially exercise for your brain cells. That new connection is happening right now, and then tonight when you go to sleep, you'll make that connection stronger. But the idea is that we want to continually make new connections because the more connections we make, it adds up. It's like putting money in the bank. Then if we lose them down the road, we still have more connections that we've made in the brain. So if you want to make a connection stronger, you review it. So if you learn something on the piano, you make the connection. Every time you practice it or practice something that you've learned, new information, you run electrical stimulation over that connection, making it stronger. And that's why it's really important to review information that we know, because if we don't review it, those brain cells actually that house the connection or the memory move apart, and that's how we get rusty or we forget. So reviewing information is fundamentally a key part in keeping that connection strong. Now, let's go deeper into what your short-term memory is. And so people often think, well, my short-term memory is what I did today, or what I did a few hours ago, or what I did maybe 10 minutes ago. But it turns out that's not your short-term memory at all in terms of brain science. And the way we learn this is by understanding this individual, HM. He's what we call the most famous patient in brain science. And just quickly what his story is and how it relates to us is that he really had a very sad thing happen to him. When he was a kid, he had a very normal upbringing. He was normal and healthy, and then he fell off of a bicycle. And that caused him to have debilitating seizures all the time. And he couldn't go to school, and as he grew up, he had a very hard time. He couldn't go to work. And the doctors at that time tried everything, and nothing was helping him. And so a surgeon had an idea, what if we remove a part of his brain? And they performed a surgery that they've never performed since, and they removed this part of his brain. This is the hippocampus. So you have 2 of these structures in your brain. They look just like this, and this is the hippocampus. And so when they removed the hippocampus, HM could no longer learn new things. He could no longer make any new memories. And what we learn from that is that this is actually how we form a short-term memory. That anything that you learn, anything that you experience, first goes to this part of your brain, and it waits there for about 7 to 10 seconds. In that 7 to 10 seconds, the rest of your brain determines, is this information worth it, or is this a complete waste of my time? If it's worth it, the information stored in the hippocampus that you've just learned in the last 7 to 10 seconds is then transferred to long-term memory storage. It goes to another part of the brain where it sticks, and then you remember it in an hour or tomorrow. And if the information is not deemed important, your brain again throws it away. Now, here's the key thing, is that most people can remember about 7 things for about 7 seconds. And if you remember when we had phone numbers that we had to remember before we had cell phones, somebody would tell you their number and you would repeat it. And you would repeat it, and that would give your hippocampus 7 more seconds to hold on to the information. And so right now, essentially your hippocampus is making a decision. Should I learn and remember my hippocampus, or is this a complete waste of my time? But remembering how your hippocampus works and understanding it really is important because it plays a key role in all of these things. Where did I park my car? Where did I put my keys? What's that person's name? What was I just doing? Because what's happening is that we're living in a world where we often don't take 2 seconds to remember where we parked our car or where we put our keys or what that person's name was or what we were just doing. We just are on to the next, on to the next, on to the next. And we're not giving our hippocampus 7 to 10 seconds to really focus on information so it gets transferred to long-term memory storage. And so a really important tip is that people, they say, oh, I'm starting to, I can't remember things, but just slowing down a little and saying, wait a second, I need to spend an extra few seconds on this. I need to really spend 7 to 10 seconds because if I focus on this information, that information then will go to long-term memory storage. Something to be aware of is that if we're doing 2 things at the same time, so we're trying to learn something while we're emailing somebody or we're texting or we're cooking, we've become very, it's very common to multitask. That when we're multitasking, the hippocampus figures, oh, this isn't important information, I'm just going to throw it away. Because really, the last thing our hippocampus wants to do is fill up with useless information. It figures, I don't want to get cluttered. I don't want to waste any space. So if it's not important, I'm just going to throw it away. So here's a little quick tip. It's silly, but it can be really helpful. The next time you meet somebody and you want to remember their name, because oftentimes people's names just disappear, as soon as they tell you their name, imagine yourself writing their name on their forehead for about 7 seconds. And the reason why that works, that little trick works, is that if you focus on their name for about 7 to 10 seconds, you've convinced your brain this person's name is worth it, as opposed to oftentimes when people tell us their name, we're just on to the next thing, and we just forget it. So a little quick, silly tip that actually is based on brain science that can really be helpful. Okay. So the take-home message from that is just really slowing down. People are surprised how often they remember things better if they just focus for a few more extra seconds. But the next part is, okay, so once the information leaves the hippocampus and it goes to long-term memory storage, where does it go? And then how do I access it? What if I'm past the 10 seconds? How do I remember what I need to remember? So if anybody saw this movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Jim Carrey in this movie, he wants to have the memory of his girlfriend erased because he has a bad breakup. But it turns out that's not possible at all. I know that's not a big surprise, but it's not possible at all even based upon how your brain works. And so it turns out that information, so for example, an ex-girlfriend or an ex-boyfriend, you might not want to remember them, so just think about a friend. But if you think about somebody in your life, the question is, well, where are they stored in your brain? Where's that memory of that person stored? So they are not stored in just a couple brain cells. You could not do a surgery or some sort of technique where you just disrupt or damage a few of your 80 billion brain cells, remove them, and the memory of that person is gone. Our brain doesn't work that way. Instead, the way you remember things is that you fragment your memories. So the way that person sounds, so think about somebody in your life, the way the sound of their voice, that's stored in the auditory part of your brain. The way the person smells, that's in the olfactory part of your memory. The way the person looks, that's in the visual part of your memory. And all this information, we go on and on, is fragmented all throughout your brain. And then when I ask you to think of that person, amazingly, your brain puts all this information together in a cohesive idea or image of that person. So the key take home is that you actually store information all throughout your brain. And that's really an important insight for remembering things, because it turns out that there's a key to remembering. So I saw a question here. I always like to take a little break at this point, and I see a question in the Q&A, and I actually see a few questions, and it's actually this question. So the question is, what about when something is at the tip of your tongue, they call that. Yeah. What if you can't remember a word, or you can't remember someone's name that you know their name, you learned it, but you can't bring it back. And so there's something about this based upon what we're talking about, and that is that your brain likes to associate things. So the first thing to be aware of is if you're having trouble remembering something, if you struggle to remember it, if you get really stressed and worried, it actually can be blocking the brain's ability to find that memory, to find where that memory is. If we just relax and take a couple deep breaths, what our brain will often do is work on it in the background and then figure out what we need to remember. Oftentimes you might be out for a walk, or you go to bed, you wake up in the morning like, oh yeah, that was that person's name, or that was that thing I was trying to remember. That's your brain working on it in the background. There's another quick tip that's really helpful, which is your brain loves to associate. We'll talk about this in a moment a little bit more in depth, but just thinking about taking a moment, taking a deep breath, saying, it will come to me, this will come back, but I need to just go through the alphabet. So A, B, C, D. And the reason why that can be helpful is that your brain associates that person's name or that thing with the first letter, and your brain will often then tag it and say, oh wait, that's that thing I need to remember. Our brain loves to associate with different aspects of our memory. And so the key take home is that since your brain fragments information all over the place, the more places you can put a memory, the better, or the more likely you are to remember it. So for example, making the memory more dynamic, or make it more aspects to it. So if you have to remember, for example, somebody's name, really trying to picture their face, think about the way they sound, think about the way they might even smell, and really focusing on those things, because memories are like nuts that squirrels hide for the winter. The more places you can store it in your brain, the more likely you're going to find it. So the more you can make the memory tap into different aspects of senses, the way the person looks, the way they sound, the way they smell, all these different things, or a funny emotional memory with that person, you're more likely to remember it because you've stored it in multiple places and you're more likely to find it. Okay, so I want to go now into some really take-home actionable tips into how to improve your memory, and these are secrets of memory champions. So there's these memory contests that people enter, and so this is the current champion, and so he memorized 400 playing cards in a couple minutes. He memorized 501 numbers in 5 minutes, 132 historical dates out of 145 minutes. And I'm saying, well, I don't want to, that's not my goal. I don't want to do that. But how they do this can be really helpful to our day-to-day memory. And so a key point is that I want to be very clear and say that the people who are these memory champions, they're born with a talent, without a doubt. It's like Michael Jordan. He was born with a talent to play basketball, but he trained, and like an athlete. And these memory champions, they train like an athlete too, and so they take that talent, they take it to unbelievable levels. But myself, I do not have the talent of Michael Jordan in basketball, but if I go out and I practice, I can get better at basketball. I'm not going to ever be like him, but I can get better. And it's the same thing with memory. Most people will never be a memory champion, but they can use these tricks to improve, just like anything in life. And so the key take home is it really does take effort for information to leave the hippocampus and go to long-term memory storage. It doesn't often happen automatically. So we have to use these tricks to make that memory stick and go into long-term memory storage. So here's one of the first tips. It's that if you want to remember anything at all, where you park, where you put your keys, somebody's name, anything at all, stop and say it out loud. And the reason why this is important is it builds upon what we were just talking about. The part of your brain that is involved with speech is different than the part of your brain that's involved in hearing what you just said. And both of those parts of the brain have memory, aspects of memory to them. And so if you say it out loud, you've just stored that memory in the part of your brain involved with speech memory and the part of your brain that's involved in hearing memory. Two more places, like you're storing nuts for the winter, that you have the opportunity to find it when you need it. So stop and say it out loud. The other thing is that we can learn from another savant. This is Daniel Tammet. Just to show you what he's done, he recited 22,514 decimal points of pi, of the mathematical constant, learned 10 languages in a week for a TV documentary. So he has high-functioning Asperger's. So he's one of these individuals who has incredible memory, but struggles with other aspects of basic memory. But he's actually talked about, he's one of the few savants that can communicate and really delve into how he does what he does. And it's really helpful for individuals improving their day-to-day memory. And so it turns out that Daniel has something called synesthesia. And synesthesia is something that oftentimes people don't know they have, but it's this idea that when they think of a number, for example, or a letter, their brain automatically gives it a specific color. Or they might even give it a certain sound or a certain taste or a certain way that it might look. And so it's very common in artists and musicians. And synesthesia at its essence means that instead of just one sense being activated, the brain is essentially cross-wired in the way that if we see a number, we also get a color associated with it. We might get the letter S might taste like waffles for somebody, or Y might taste like, broccoli or something like that. And so people have different versions of this, but the idea is that we find that people who have really incredible memories oftentimes have synesthesia. And it's based upon two ideas. A, they're storing more information in more places, and B, they're associating it to things that have feeling and things that have emotion. And that's another key point, is that things that are just random to us, we have a very hard time remembering. We remember the things that make us laugh, the things that make us cry, because those are things that are based upon our survival. We're really not meant to remember our passwords. That's just a string of numbers. But if we make it emotional, we're tying into all these different emotional senses of the brain. We're storing it in more places. We're oftentimes cross-wiring the memory, and it makes it easier to remember it and bring it back. So the second tip is associate it. Anything you have to remember, take a moment and say, I'm going to give this, I'm going to assign it a smell, or I'm going to assign it a taste or a flavor. And I say, wait, that seems so silly. But if you try these things, people are surprised how often they start remembering things because they build the memory out and they attach it to a sense in their brain. This is what memory champions do. It's not just automatic that they're remembering things. They're actually using these little tricks and techniques. The third trick is visualize it. And we actually did that one at the beginning. That's imagining it on certain parts of your face, tapping into location memory, parts of your home. Taking a moment and making the memory something that has a location can be very powerful to tap into, as opposed to just a list of numbers or names or just a to-do list or a grocery list. This extra step can be helpful. The fourth thing is, why should we make it emotional? Why is that so important? Why do we remember things that are emotional? I want to give you a quick insight into how your brain is structured. This is your hippocampus right here, this structure in blue. And this little yellow dot here is your amygdala. That's the emotional part of your brain. Anything that's emotional, anything that makes you feel, makes you scared or worried or laugh or happy, is stored in this part of your brain. This is the emotional center of your brain. Look at how our brain evolved. Your hippocampus, your short-term memory, is right next to the amygdala. So what that means is that when you have to remember something, information, actually the hippocampus coordinates finding the information. That's something else the hippocampus is involved in. And since the amygdala is right next to the hippocampus, it's almost like there's a room right next to the waiting room. And since the information is stored right next to the waiting room, it's much easier to find this information, as opposed to if the information is far away. So for example, a string of random numbers or letters or just a random list, that's stored on the outside of your brain, which is out here on the outer edge, the outside cortex, and your brain gets lost trying to find that information, whereas emotional information is just right next to the hippocampus. So if you can't remember your password, and you keep hitting password reset, it's the worst. Don't feel bad. Your brain is really not meant to remember things like that. So just make it emotional next time. Make it something that really makes you laugh. Make it as silly as possible. If you want to go that route, make it scary if you like that sort of thing. But the idea is that make it something you feel. You'll store it in your amygdala. And when you store it in your amygdala, it's much easier for the brain to find it as opposed to just making it random. Okay. So we're going to go back to HM for a second. And so I want to tell you that he was studied his whole life. Again, he couldn't make any new memories, but there was a scientist who studied him, and she really came up with this incredible insight into another aspect of memory. And so what she did was she gave HM, she actually met with him several days in a row for months, and she gave him a pen and a paper, and she said, we want to see if you can learn to draw a double-sided star, just like you're seeing here. But when you draw it, you're going to have to look in a mirror. You won't be able to see it straight on. There's going to be something blocking, and you'll have to watch in a mirror and see if you can do this. And if you were to do this, very likely, in a couple tries, maybe in a day or two, you'd grab the pencil and you just draw it very quickly. Your brain would remember how to do this. And so the scientist figured, well, HM will never learn how to do this. He'll never master it. Turns out, a couple days of practice, he grabbed the pencil and he just drew it perfectly. And she said to him, how did you do that? And he said, I don't know. I have no recollection of ever learning that or remember you ever teaching me this or showing it, but somehow it's there now. I remember. And that really gives us this really powerful insight into a second form of memory. There's a type of memory that essentially we believe bypasses the hippocampus. and it's our motor memory. This is why we never forget how to ride a bicycle. This is why in most cases, people who even have amnesia don't forget how to button their shirt or tie their shoelaces. Motor memory is extremely powerful, and it bypasses the hippocampus, and it's something we can tap into. Just to show you, there's these studies coming out that have found that people who even have early stages of dementia, they can remember words better if they make a little doodle of them, if they draw them, because they're tapping into motor memory. Study after study has shown that if people try to remember words like cake or all the, a list of words, they have a hard time doing it. But if you ask them to draw a picture of it, they remember when they're tested later on at a much higher level. They remember more words. And if you think about it, it really factors into a lot of things we talked about. It's a motor memory once you draw it. When you draw it, you probably have more of an emotion tied to it. You're building out what this memory is instead of just a random group of letters, C-A-K-E. You're actually drawing the candle that might remind you of a birthday you had or a great memory or even a bad memory, but it builds the memory out and allows us to actually remember. So don't be afraid to make a little drawing if you're trying to remember something or make a doodle besides a list. This tapping into this really powerful motor memory and drawing memory is something that is really becoming something to even help people who are having serious issues with their memory. Okay, so last point on this section is that in order to in order to remember things, don't be afraid of silly mnemonics. I know people say, that's from being a kid. But even the things that we've just talked about, we can make a mnemonic. Look at the word saved. To make a memory saved, S is say it out loud, A is associate it, V is visualize it, E is make it emotional, and D is draw it. We covered all 5 of these tricks. And whenever I mention this, I usually, before we get to that, I want to tell you this, is that just to show you the power of this, is that who remembers Roy G. Biv? The colors of the rainbow. These things really stick in our brain. If you don't remember the Great Lakes, think about using Show Me, S-H-O-M-E, and all the different lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario. And if you don't remember them, tomorrow, say, show me, and see if you can remember them. See how powerful that is as opposed to just trying to remember the lakes. Most people, these little mnemonics are really, really helpful. They're used by all these different memory champions and these people with incredible memories. So the other thing is we want to review it tomorrow. Look over these notes, and you'll get access to a video if you want to review it. Or anything you want to learn, take time to review it. That's when you make the connection stronger. That's when it really sticks. If we don't review it, the brain figures, I don't need that connection, and it pulls apart. That actually happens in the sleeping process. Your brain determines not needed, and it pulls the memory apart, or does need it based upon if you practiced it that day or recently. Whenever I mention these techniques, usually somebody, I can tell they're either thinking, and I understand this, or they say to me, I don't want to use those techniques. I don't want to go through the effort of SAVED, and I don't want to have to do that. I just want to remember. And so I want to tell you that's really like saying, I really want to look like this, but I don't want to go to the gym. And so it turns out that it's very similar. Our brain, in essence, is very much like a muscle, and if we don't work it out, and we don't take these little steps, it can be very hard just to say, make it stick or just stick there. Last big point is I want to share with you this last quick story that is an insight into memory. There's really 2 types of amnesia, and we can learn about our memory and optimize it by understanding when memory doesn't work. And so we've learned quite a bit from amnesia. So there's a type of amnesia called anterior grade amnesia, and that's in the movie Memento. If you saw that movie, the character in that movie could no longer learn new things. He could remember his past, but he couldn't remember anything new. And that was because he had damage to his hippocampus in this movie. And that actually is based upon HM. There's another type of amnesia called retrograde amnesia. That's the one we might be much more familiar with. It's in soap operas, it's in movies like Born Identity. The idea that somebody has an accident and they can't remember their past. They can still remember new things, but their whole past is wiped out. That's called retrograde amnesia. Again, that's actually very rare because somebody would have to have damage to their whole brain for them to wipe out all their memories. Remember, memories are stored all throughout the brain. But I want to tell you there's an individual named Clive who suffers from both anterior grade and retrograde amnesia. So it's actually, he had an infection in his brain and he developed both anterior and retrograde. And what that means is he can't access his past memory and he cannot make any new memories. And so he lives in the perpetual present of these 7 seconds. If you were to meet him and introduce yourself, 7 seconds later, he would not know who you were. You'd have to reintroduce yourself. And so before this all happened, before he developed both anterior grade and retrograde amnesia, he was a concert pianist. He played with the symphony in England. And after he developed these types of amnesia, he could still play piano like he played before at this incredible level. And that was very mystifying. How is that possible? How is that possible? Well, let me give you a little bit more insight into this. He could still play the piano, play all these songs he could play, but he couldn't tell you the name of the song, where he learned it, or anything about the song, but he could still play it. And the reason that is that the playing of the song is a motor memory. So that was still intact. His motor memory was still there, but his ability to remember the name of it or where he learned it or any information about it, that was no longer accessible. Now, one last thing about Clive Wearing is that he is married, and his wife has stayed through him through this entire process, and she's still with him now. And so she wrote a book on her experience, and she talks about that, every time she's with him, every time that she sees him, 7 seconds later, she has to reintroduce himself, and she wrote in her book that Clive Wearing gets a new wife every 7 seconds. And one other aspect about this is really interesting is that when he sees his wife, he doesn't know who she is in essence, but every time he sees her, he actually trembles and shakes a little bit with excitement. Even though it's, to him, in essence, the first time he's seen her, something deep in his brain does recognize her, and he's always essentially very excited to see her. And the reason I bring this up is that it really highlights this idea that there's aspects of our memory that we absolutely understand, and there's aspects of our memory that are still quite magical. We don't really know why he still recognizes her, but he does. And that's really the magical part of memory that we still have yet to understand, but it's definitely there. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate you taking the time. To receive 3 surprising tips that significantly lower risk for dementia, please visit this link, or you can email me at info@drmarcmilstein.com. Just mention that you saw this video from the Rancho Santa Fe Senior Center. Thanks.